All right. Again, we're going to do a short video. I'm going to move very, very quickly through the slides as I did with the last few, and I hope it still proves useful for you as you go through here from the end of the Han to the end of the Tang. So we're going to track the readings for this week from the Deberry. Again, we're going to move very quickly. Okay, we talked a little bit about this, what brought about the end of the Han dynasty, which was divided into two in the middle with the Wang Mang interregnum, the brief Xin dynasty. It's Xin, the brief Xin dynasty, goes in between the former, or the Western, and the latter, or the Eastern Han. And these are the causes that bring down the Han dynasty. We're going to see the arrival of Buddhism. We haven't talked about that yet in these lectures, but you've come across that in your readings and also in the short videos, the short documentaries that you've got accompanying these texts. So after the fall of the Han, we have this so-called period of disunity. And as I said last time, I think really this should be in quotation marks, because when we call this period from about 220 to about 580, the period of disunity, we're assuming that unity is the norm in China. And I'm not sure that that's the case, or I think even if it is the case, it takes some defense to make that case. That is, we assume that there's a sort of default factory settings that is some kind of unified imperial bureaucracy that is a sort of Chinese imperial authority. And I don't think that's necessarily a safe assumption, or again, one that doesn't need to be proven. Okay, so as we go into the period of disunity, fall of the Han, the Three Kingdoms period, we'll talk a little bit about. Some of you may be familiar with that if you're big historical video gamers. It's a very famous video game called The Three Kingdoms that some students have told me about. I haven't tried it, but I heard it's a lot of fun. There's also a very, very long 2008 film by John Woo, who's normally known for the sort of Hong Kong detective procedural shoot 'em up kind of action movies. John Woo made a film called Red Cliff. It's about this Three Kingdoms period. And it's something like it's somewhat analogous to the Arthurian legend period in Chinese history. If you think of sort of King Arthur and that kind of thing, which is this sort of mix of fact and fiction and history and legend and that kind of thing. Okay, and these are the other periods, again, that you can roughly break this period down into. One thing I think that's noteworthy is this period here, the Southern and Northern dynasties, the Northern Wei, the 12 Xianbei, they're going to more or less what we call Sinicize, or Sino is the Latin prefix for all things Chinese. That is, they're going to take on Chinese attributes. Chinese nationalists, Chinese sort of patriotic historians like to talk about how invading dynasties Sinicized or became Chinese. The implication there is that the cultural heft of Chinese identity is so inevitable, is so inexorable, that if somebody invades them, then they will kind of colonize them from the inside. They will, because of the efficacy and the excellence of their cultural traditions, the invaders will become Chinese. And the Xianbei from the north is one example. Then later, we're going to have the Mongols toward the end of our time together here in the Yuan dynasty in the 13th century. Of course, Genghis Khan and his famous grandson, Kublai Khan. And then the Manchus, the Qing dynasty that starts around the 1630s and 40s. They also, according to these sort of nationalistic or patriotic Chinese historians, Sinicize or become Chinese. It's actually a controversial subject, an interesting one. So whenever we talk about that, that idea is sort of on the table. Okay, internal rebellions. We'll talk about this very, very briefly. But this is always an anxiety for any leaders, any rulers. In China, particularly the millenarian or sort of religiously fanatic movements like the Yellow Turbans or the Heavenly Masters are going to be especially devastating to the dynasty. And then Buddhism also is going to come in. So you have these sort of fanatical Taoist and Buddhist rebels. We often think of Taoism and Buddhism as these very peaceful, sort of blissed out religions or philosophies that get connected with peaceful meditation and that kind of thing. But there's another side of these, which I think is really important to note throughout history, and that is sort of fanatical religious groups. There are many strains of Buddhism within the Buddhist tradition. There isn't just one Buddhism. There are many, many Buddhisms. And some of them have very violent traditions. Some of them have fanatical belief structures. And of course, the ones that come down to us today, whether it's Zen or Pure Land or Lotus Sutra Buddhism or those kind of things, they often become affiliated with more peaceful groups, or of course Tibetan Buddhism. But I think it's helpful for us to remember that some of these groups also get latched onto Taoism and Buddhism because of their potential to subvert the social and political order of Confucianism here. And so that's what I've noted here. Confucianism becomes a target for criticism because as the Han Dynasty wanes or becomes weaker, so too does the underpinning philosophy, which, remember, Han China becomes Confucian China. And it does that as a way of distancing itself from the legalist traditions of the brief Qin dynasty. And so as the political fortunes of the Han wane, so too does Confucianism become a target. And Taoism is an old challenger, and Buddhism is a new challenger. Buddhism arrives, of course, along what we today call the Silk Roads, or the land routes that connect the Indian civilization with Chinese civilization. That's a name that the Silk Roads is a name that it only gets in the 19th century, thanks to a German geographer. But today we use that term sort of ahistorically, retroactively to refer to that region. Yellow turbans we talked about just now. Again, connecting fanatical Taoism and Buddhism, the heavenly master. And again, you can pause these slides and you can take a little bit more time and look at them. The heavenly masters is a group again that connects Taoism in this case, fanatical Taoism with a little bit of Buddhism and also local cultural beliefs. And these sort of cultish figures like Zhang Daoling here become sort of magical leaders. They can perform exorcisms, and they become possessed by spirits themselves, and they can sort of channel these spirits. You see this kind of stuff still on YouTube. This kind of fanatical religious belief that is always subversive to social order and political order. But you see these fanatics follow them and become enormously violent and challenge the ruling dynasty. So again, these are some things that mark the period of disunity. We see this idea of sinification. Again, I'm going to move through these very quickly. You can pause as you see fit. Please don't only take my quick lecture here, but also look at the slideshow, which I've shared with you on your own time. Feel free to pause this anytime and take your notes. Okay, here are the three kingdoms. This is the division of China after the Han Dynasty. Here's a quick note on that. The three kingdoms are Wei, Shu, and Wu. We see something like sort of Arthurian legend here. When we say the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is a 15th century novel, we don't mean romance in the sort of love and romance kind of way, but in the romance of sort of Arthurian legend or mythology and chivalry and that kind of thing, historical epics. I'm going to jump through a few of the major figures here. Cao Cao is very famous. We mentioned him in the Chinese idiom proverb video. Cao Cao, Cao Cao Jiu Dao. When you say Cao Cao's name, he arrives, so to speak, of the devil. He's a very, very famous military leader from this period. Zhuge Liang is another. And again, I'm not spending a lot of time on these. I'm going to jump right through. One label for the different periods in this time is Southern and Northern dynasties. This is noteworthy because until this point, all Chinese social and political order from the Xia Shangzhou Bronze dynasties through the Qin and the Han, they're all in the Yellow River Valley up in the north. And it's only after the period of disunity that we start to see Southern China becoming incorporated into the Chinese polity in a really thoroughgoing way. We see rice cultivation in the south become more important. Silk cultivation or sericulture is also thriving in the south, and that becomes incorporated. So we see really important distinctions between southern and northern China. This is the first time that southern dynasties, southern regimes really become connected with China. and actually become sort of seen by Southerners as the keepers of the cultural flame, so to speak. Okay, the Northern Wei, Toba Wei, this is this idea of Sinicization, because the Xianbei, the rulers of the Northern Wei, are Xianbei people. They're not from what we'd call China proper, closer to the Xiongnu, or the sort of proto-Mongols. And I'm moving through all these dynasties. Some of them only get touched on very briefly in the Ibri, so you don't have to remember all of these. And this division between North and South is what I was just talking about here a second ago. This becomes very important to note that Southern and Northern China are distinct culturally, socially, politically, economically. The agriculture is very different. And this is the division more or less between Northern and Southern China. Again, we're still not dealing with that full sort of rooster shape map, and won't be until the very end of our course. Okay, the New South, this is again something I noted here. Southerners see themselves as far from the Northern barbarians. This is the beginning of a tradition in China of Southerners as seeing themselves as more culturally sophisticated than the Northerners. The reason for that is that the Northerners are close to the Mongols, or the Xiongnu, or the Xianbei people, who are Northern pastoral nomads. And in the Chinese cosmology, or in the Chinese sort of cultural, you might say racist view of the world order, they see themselves as highly civilized, and they see those Northerners as barbaric. Same thing's happening in ancient Rome at about the same time. Is that the people in the Greco-Roman world see the people of Northern Europe as barbaric, as uncivilized. That's where our word barbarian comes from. So I think that's important that we remember that these are the views through which this history is coming down to us. Okay, art and calligraphy becomes very, very big in this period. I'm not going to stop here, but please take a look if you're interested. Taoism and Buddhism are becoming increasingly important within Chinese culture, Chinese cosmology. So just pause these and take a look at a few of these bullet points that I put here. Just a quick note on Buddhism, where it comes from. Shakyamuni, or Siddhartha Gautama, comes from what is today northeastern India. It starts with the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama. I'm not going to go into the whole story because you're going to be watching that film. You're going to be watching that documentary. And in the documentary, you learn about the Four Noble Truths. Life is suffering. Suffering is caused by desire, craving. Suffering can be eliminated by eliminating desire, craving. Now, those are hasty translations, and you follow the Eightfold Path to eliminate suffering and desire and craving. Those are hasty translations of words like suffering and desire. And the Sanskrit words of dukkha and klesha are quite are much more interesting, much more sophisticated and complex than our sort of hasty, rough translations here. Okay, these two you've encountered in the text. You can take some time to read a little bit more about Zhang Qian and Xuanzang. These are both very important people in terms of understanding the arrival of Buddhism in China and the ways in which Buddhism challenges the Confucian orthodoxy, especially in terms of filial piety. I'm going to move quickly here. Tiantai is one school of Buddhism. Pause and take your time. Chan is another one here. You can understand these different modes, the complexity and the diversity of the Buddhist tradition here. Pure Land is yet another, a later development in Buddhist teaching. And this tradition of sand painting here is something that we also see in the indigenous American tradition. It emphasizes transience, or that is the sort of passing nature of beauty. And we see that in sand paintings like the one being made here in this Navajo picture, but also in the Tibetan Buddhist one in the upper left. These are made to emphasize the transience, or the passing nature, the brief nature of life, or the beauty, because at the end they're swept aside. At the end, this extremely ornate and carefully detailed, beautiful thing is simply swept into a pile, as a reminder that our the best laid plans of mice and men are just for briefly for this realm. Okay, the Mogao Caves in Dunhuang give us a little bit of a sense of the ways in which Buddhism traveled along through, especially Western China. Sometimes they're patronized, sometimes they're not. That is, sometimes they're funded, sometimes they're not. Moving through here very quickly. These are some quite spectacular images. If you want to, you can take some time and pause these and take a look at them. But we see the devotional act of these beautiful structures being made. Tibetan Buddhism is just one version of Buddhism. It's not the only one. The Dalai Lama is not the Pope of Buddhism. There are many, many Buddhists. There are many, many types of Buddhists. And Tibetan Buddhism is one of them and develops around the time of the Tang Dynasty. Okay, take your time, pause here as you see fit. These are some of the influences, again, that Buddhism has. These are the dynasties of so-called medieval China. I'm going to move through them very quickly, and you can obviously, as I said, pause and take time to understand them. The dynastic cycle is something that we've discussed, the Mandate of Heaven. It's very abbreviated for the short Sui dynasty. So the Sui dynasty is only a couple decades there. And so that it gets collapsed, just like in the Qin. So you can think of these two analogous periods. The Qin is to the Han as the Sui is to the Tang, sort of one of those SAT analogies, if you want. Teleologies, as we talked about. The importance of the Sui dynasty comes in these major contributions that this brief dynasty makes. One is the consolidation of the examination system, the land equalization system. The Great Wall becomes a little bit more thorough. Buddhism arrives, and the Grand Canal is an artificial waterway that you see in the upper right here that connects northern China with southern China for the first time. This is a little bit of the Sui. There are really only two emperors of the Sui, Sui Wendi and Sui Yangdi. Again, these are the major contributions that the Sui makes. The Sui collapse comes quick after its very, very brief reign. Sui Wendi is seen as the virtuous ruler, and Sui Yangdi is seen as the wicked ruler. One of the important things that Sui Yangdi does is tries to expand the empire through military conquest. For this reason, he's seen as less legitimate than his father, who in a more Confucian mode wanted to, or at least was framed by historians, later historians, as not trying to invade China's neighbors, particularly toward the Korean Peninsula. Okay, Sui legacy again, we've been over this. The establishment of the Tang. Take your time here. That's Xuanzang, the Buddhist pilgrim that we mentioned a minute ago. He makes his way to what is today northeastern India to seek the original Buddhist texts. Aristocracy emerges somewhat in the Tang, or rather re-emerges to some extent. And the Tang dynasty is seen as a period of relative stability, but also there are conservative Confucians who are concerned about the ways in which Tang governance develops. And a big part of that is Buddhism. Buddhism is something that the Confucians are not terribly happy about. Again, in the ways that it challenges filial piety or family connections, and a number of other factors. Art and poetry becomes heavily influenced by the ideas of impermanence and art for art's sake, beauty for beauty's sake that we see in Buddhism and Taoism. The so-called cosmopolitan or global or we'd say today international, although that word's anachronistic, the kind of global culture of the Tang dynasty becomes an important aspect of its identity. There is territorial expansion here. And we see the Confucian examination system continue to hold a lot of sway, but not being really the only game in town, because we see Buddhism taking a very important role also. The Tang capital. When we think of the spread of Chinese culture in early periods to places like Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia, it's really the Tang when it's the glorious, splendid Tang from the 7th to the 10th centuries, the 600s to the 900s. That's the version of Chinese culture that gets promulgated to its neighbors. These really splendid markets and global kind of globalized cities, I think is a fair thing to say. So on the one hand, you have Tang splendor, and then according to the Confucian critics, you have Tang decadence. And there becomes a concern among Confucians that decadence is becoming a problem. Another aspect of Buddhist culture here is evident in relative gender equality. I don't think Buddhists are sort of 21st century gender theory aware, but they do have less of a patriarchal stricture in terms of gender roles. And that's evident in the Empress Wu, who declares herself emperor in her own right, and is very powerful. Now, she's not the only one. There are a number of other women in this period who gained great prominence, including Yang Guifei and others. And so we see the role of women, a social public role of women expanding during the Tang Dynasty, and that may be in part because of the influences of Buddhism. We also see Buddhism spurring rebellions, including the Huangchao rebellion. Empress Wu here, we can see again that portrait, the upper portrait is not contemporary. It's from much later. But Empress Wu becomes very prominent. She establishes a brief kind of an interregnum of a Zhou dynasty, rules in her own name, which was unheard of at that point for a woman to do. Yang Guifei also very prominent, a woman politically and socially, as initially simply as the favorite royal concubine of Xuanzong, but she becomes more than that. She also becomes linked to a number of figures, including An Lushan. And we see a kind of trope emerge here in Chinese history, a sort of misogynistic trope in which, sort of like a Yoko Ono kind of a syndrome here, where she becomes blamed for the failings of the empire. And so as the Tang starts to fall, some of the Confucian, more patriarchal conservatives blame the increasing role of women during the Tang Dynasty for its downfall. And so we're going to see in the Song Dynasty next a kind of backlash to this. And that's going to have a number of markers, one of which is the emergence of foot binding. Okay, we're going to bump through these quickly. The An Lushan is going to become crucial for bringing down the Tang. Conservatives are sort of waiting in the wings, and we see a sort of a blaming of Buddhism and a number of factors for the downfall of the Tang Dynasty. So we'll go on. We'll start there. Again, I know I moved very quickly here, but we will wrap it up for now. And you can take the time you want to work through this slideshow, and also to pause the video anytime where you want to make some notes. All right, thanks, and I'll see you in the next video.